The girl fell from the saddle like a broken sparrow, dust rising around her small, crumpled frame. Behind her, gunshots still echoed across the canyons, and somewhere deep in the sagebrush, voices called out her name, voices thick with violence and vengeance. James Jed Albright stood motionless by the fence line he'd been mending, a coil of barbed wire in his hands, and the sun bleeding red across the New Mexico sky. For a moment, the land was quiet again. Too quiet, no bird song, no breeze, just the kind of silence that knew how to wait. Then came the sound, faint, hollow, but unmistakable, the rattle of hooves, not far off, and a child's weak cry. Jed dropped the wire. He found her near the dry creek bed, tangled in her own skirt and the reins of a frightened pony that had bolted. She was barely conscious, maybe 13 or 14, and the blood on her dress was too much for such a small body. Her skin was dark, wind-chapped, and her braid had come loose, leaving strands across a face etched in dust and fear. Jed knelt beside her, his hands steady from years of quiet work and sudden danger. "Easy, child," he murmured, brushing the grit from her cheek. Her eyes fluttered open, and for an instant, something ancient and wild stared back at him. Pain, yes, but also a knowing that didn't belong in someone so young. He looked to the west toward the direction of the shots. No one in sight yet, but the dust clouds on the horizon meant company wasn't far behind. Trouble had found this girl, and if he lifted her into his arms, it'd find him too. Jed paused. His whole life had been about avoiding this moment, other people's fights, other people's blood. But then his fingers brushed against something cool at her throat. A broken silver cross, snapped from its chain, nestled against her collarbone. He exhaled slowly. "Lord," he whispered, "if I walk away from this now, what kind of man am I?" With that, he slid his arms beneath her and lifted her gently, her head falling limp against his chest. He whistled low to his mare, and the horse trotted over, calm as ever. By the time he swung her up into the saddle, he'd already made a choice that would cost him everything. Some burdens, Jed would later say, ain't burdens at all. They're invitations. Oh, the wind rose as he led the horse along the narrow trail back to his homestead, a small cabin nestled between two ridges, far from the reach of the nearest town. The girl shivered once, even in the heat, and murmured something in a language he didn't recognize. Apache, maybe, or something older. Jed glanced at her again. He didn't speak, but his jaw was set like granite. This wasn't the first time he'd gone against his better judgment, but it was the first time in a long while he'd felt like it mattered. The fence, the dust, the wire, all of it faded behind them. What lay ahead was harder to name, but somewhere deep inside him, where the silence had lived too long, a voice stirred low and steady like scripture remembered in the dark. "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did unto me." And so the rider and the girl disappeared into the dying light, neither knowing that by morning, a war would come looking for both of them. The cabin stood like a secret low and weather-worn, its wood faded gray by sun and wind, tucked between two sloping ridges that turned golden in the last light. Jed pushed open the door with his shoulder, careful not to jostle the girl too much. Inside, it smelled of old pine, iron tools, and ash from the morning's fire. He laid her down on the narrow cot by the hearth, then knelt beside her to inspect the wound. Bullet graze, shallow but angry, torn flesh along her shoulder, already dark with dried blood. She flinched as he cut away the fabric, her eyes flickering open again. Jed spoke low, not expecting a reply. "I've seen worse," he said, mostly to himself, "but I ain't seen many pull through alone." She didn't answer. Her breathing was shallow. Sweat slicked her temple. He poured water into a tin bowl, dipped a clean rag, and began dabbing the wound. She whimpered once, then bit down on her knuckles to keep silent. That small act told Jed more than words ever could. He reached for the whiskey bottle on the shelf. "This'll hurt," he warned. Still, she didn't protest. As he worked, the fire crackled. casting flickering shadows against the log walls. Outside, the world had gone still, again like it was listening. When the bandage was tied and tight, Jed stirred the fire, added a log, and brought a tin cup of warm broth to her lips. She drank, slow and cautious, eyes never leaving his. "Name?" he asked softly. She hesitated. "Elisa?" she said, her voice dry and wary. Jed nodded once, then stepped back. He didn't push her further. Instead, he picked up her torn satchel and rummaged for anything useful. That's when he found it tucked in the side pocket, wrapped in worn linen. A silver crucifix, old and finely wrought, the chain broken clean. His fingers paused, holding the small cross in his palm. He stared at it a long moment, thumb brushing its edge, like one might read Braille, like he was reading a prayer long forgotten. And in that moment, another fire burned behind his eyes. He saw his daughter Grace barefoot in a white dress, laughing as she picked desert lilies on Easter morning. He saw his wife kneeling by the window, whispering prayers into the sunrise. He saw the small wooden cross they'd carved together and set by her grave when the fever took her. So many graves, so much silence. Jed blinked. The past faded, but not completely. Behind him, Elisa stirred. "My papa," she murmured. "They still have him." He turned. "Who?" "They took us. Days ago. Said he was a problem. He's a preacher. We were traveling to the mission south of Fort Sumner, but they didn't want him speaking. Not to the tribes, not to anyone." Who were they?" "Men with badges, but not law. Not really." That was all she said. It was enough. Jed stepped out into the cool night air and listened. He could feel it now coming. Not just riders, not just vengeance. Something bigger, like a storm still below the ridgeline, waiting to show its teeth. He lit the lantern on the porch and turned back toward the house. Inside, Elisa slept, her small form curled beneath the wool blanket, one hand clutching the silver cross like it was the last piece of her world still unbroken. Jed sat in the chair by the fire and stared into the flame. Who was chasing her? And what did they think she'd seen? Before we dive into everything, let us know in the comments, where are you watching this video from? Connecting with viewers from all across the world has been a huge source of inspiration for us. At first light, the world looked peaceful, deceptively so. The high ridges blushed pink, the sky thin and pale like a sheet stretched too tight. Jed stood outside, coffee cup in hand, his rifle resting by the door. He hadn't slept. The girl was still breathing steady, but her fever hadn't broken. The land was too quiet. That's when he saw it. Far down the valley, a dust plume rose low and slow at first, then splitting into two. Riders. Fast. Riding like men with a destination they already hated. Jed stepped back inside. The girl was awake now, sitting up, weak but alert. She'd wrapped herself in the wool blanket, and her eyes followed him, sharp and frightened. "They're coming," he said simply. She didn't ask who. Instead, she reached for her satchel, clutching it tight to her chest like armor. Jed knelt in front of her. "We'll figure it," he said. "But you need to stay low, stay quiet. If anything happens, there's a root cellar out back." Elisa looked at him a long time. "They'll kill you," she said. Not a question, a statement. Jed didn't blink. "Maybe, but I reckon I'll make it inconvenient for them." Outside, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder. He poured water into a basin, rinsed his face, ran a wet hand through his graying hair. Then he grabbed the rifle, checked the rounds, and stepped out to meet whatever had found him. 4 riders came into view, hard-faced men with dust-caked coats and eyes that didn't bother pretending. One of them wore a tarnished badge, but it meant nothing in this part of the world. Their horses were foam-lipped, sweat-streaked. They'd been riding hard. The man in front tipped his hat, but didn't smile. "You James Albright?" "I am." "Name's Clyde Whitaker, territorial deputized. We're chasing a fugitive. Young Apache girl, ran from custody. Armed. Dangerous. Jed didn't move. I'm not law. And I don't much deal in other folks' hunts. She's a thief, took something don't belong to her. Jed let his eyes drift to the horizon behind them empty. Not a soul following. No posse. No real law. What'd she take? He asked. Clyde hesitated. Information. Funny kind of thing to bleed over. Another man leaned forward in the saddle. We tracked her prints through the brush. They end at your fence. Jed didn't look away. A lot of prints out there. Could have been anyone. No, Clyde said, his smile sharp and cold. She's here. I can smell the fear. Behind Jed, the wooden door creaked barely audible, but Clyde heard it. He stepped down from his horse, motioned the others to spread out. We ain't here to play, old man. That girl's not who you think she is. She's Apache. And her father's the one stirring up every tribe from Red Mesa to Fort Craig. Jed raised his rifle, slow and steady. Then maybe it's your kind causing the stir. You hiding her? Jed didn't answer. The silence said enough. Clyde nodded to one of his men, who reached for his gun. Jed's voice cut through the rising tension like a blade. You so sure you want to find out what I've got behind this door? The man hesitated. So did Clyde. Then came a voice from within the house weak, but clear. Leave us, in the name of the Lord. It was Elisa. Clyde's eyes narrowed. His fingers twitched. You've made a choice, he said. Jed nodded. A long time ago. Clyde didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood there, dust clinging to his boots, eyes fixed on the cabin like he could peel back the walls with hate alone. Then his voice dropped to something colder than gunmetal. You're putting your life on the line for a girl you don't even know. That's a fool's wager. Jed lowered his rifle slightly, but only enough to show he wasn't shooting first. Might be, but I'd rather be a fool with a soul than whatever kind of man you are. One of Clyde's riders shifted in the saddle, muttering, He's bluffing. Let's just take her. Clyde held up a hand. I know your type, Albright, he said. Veteran, drifter, hiding from something back east, maybe God himself. You think one good deed's gonna wash you clean? Jed didn't flinch. Don't need clean, just right. Behind him, the door creaked again. Elisa had moved closer to the window, the broken cross still wrapped in her hand like a talisman. Her eyes met Jed's through the crack and, in that look, he saw it. The flicker of trust, trembling, but real. Clyde stepped back toward his horse. You bought yourself some time, he said, his tone turning almost pleasant. But not much. See, her father's made himself an enemy of the territory. And that girl she's not just his blood. She's the message he meant to send. Jed narrowed his gaze. Message to who? To every tribe. From the Rio Grande to the Utah line. She's proof he can reach us anywhere. That's why we need her. Not to kill her. To make her talk. Jed spat into the dirt. Don't sound like justice to me. Clyde mounted up again, slow and deliberate. It's the only kind left out here. The riders turned, leaving behind the scent of sweat and threat in the rising heat. But before they disappeared into the brush, Clyde looked back, one last time. You've got until sundown, then we come back. And this time, we don't ask. Jed watched them go, the tension in his shoulders slow to unwind. The wind had picked up now low and dry, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and smoke. Storms brewing, he thought, but not the kind you could outrun. Inside, Elisa sat near the fire, clutching the blanket around her. She looked up as he stepped through the door. They'll kill you, she whispered. Maybe, Jed replied, pouring water into the kettle. But I reckon I've faced worse men than him. Then why do you look scared? He stirred the fire with the poker. Because this time, it ain't just my life that's at stake. She was quiet for a while, then said, He thinks my father's trying to start a war. Jed looked at her. Is he? No, she said, voice trembling. He's trying to stop one. Outside, the sky darkened, though the sun still hung high. Inside, Jed picked up the broken cross from the table and tied a leather thong through it. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, her fingers brushing his with something that felt like a prayer unspoken. Not all storms come to destroy, Jed thought. Some come to wash the dust away. Night fell like a curtain, quick, heavy, final. Jed lit only one lamp and pulled the curtains tight. The silence outside had changed. It was no longer the peaceful hush of wilderness, but something more alert, like the land itself, was holding its breath. Inside, the fire whispered low, casting long shadows over the wooden walls. Elisa sat at the edge of the cot, her legs wrapped beneath her, the cross necklace now around her neck again. She had barely spoken since Clyde left, but Jed could see it building in her the weight of something that needed to come out. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a breath. "My name isn't just Elisa." Jed looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle. He didn't speak, just nodded for her to continue. "I was born Elisa Talisa Nantan," she said slowly, "daughter of Reverend Jeremiah Nantan and Sula of the White Flame Band." Jed blinked. The name carried weight. He'd heard it before. Jeremiah Nantan, the preacher who traveled with Apache bands across Arizona and New Mexico, delivering not just the word but medical aid and food. Loved by many, hated by more, especially by the men who'd grown rich from war and displacement. "He's half white," she added, "but my mother is Apache. They married in secret when the mission was still standing." Jed sat back in his chair. "Your father's the man Clyde once silenced." She nodded. "He preached against the land grabbers, called them out, told the tribes they had a right to resist peacefully, with unity, with truth. They hated that more than war." "And what about you?" "I carried his letters, messages between the bands. They found me with a satchel." Her voice cracked. "I threw it into the river when I ran, but they think I still know what was in it." Jed exhaled, slow and steady. He looked at her like a man studying a storm front. "Beautiful, dangerous, misunderstood. You're not just some runaway," he said. "You're the fuse." She flinched at the word. Jed leaned forward. "Listen, girl. I've fought in wars, rode with good men who died for reasons they couldn't name. But if what you say is true, then this is bigger than you. Or me." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I didn't want you helping." "Well," he said, standing to add more wood to the fire, "it's a little late for that." She almost smiled. Then, quietly, she reached into her satchel and pulled out something wrapped in oilskin, a folded piece of paper, fragile and worn from travel. "They didn't find this," she said. "I kept it in my boot." Jed unfolded the paper gently. It was a hand-drawn map, simple, but marked with X's and circles. Beneath each symbol was a name. Old missions, abandoned outposts, small canyons known only to locals. And in the corner, scribbled in Reverend Nantan's handwriting, "Our people will meet again beneath the cross and the cliff. Hope walks among the stones." Jed stared at the words, feeling their weight. Hope. That word hadn't belonged out here in years. "You're not just hunted," he murmured. "You're the bridge between two worlds." A sudden gust of wind rattled the shutters. Elisa looked up, startled. Jed stood and walked to the window. Far off, beyond the ridge, he saw a flicker like a lantern being shuttered once, then twice. A signal. He turned to the girl. "Get some rest. We're not alone out here." Elisa nodded, curling beneath the blanket. As Jed returned to his chair, he touched the edge of the map once more and whispered a quiet prayer. "Lord, if you've put this burden in my path, give me strength enough to carry it." Morning broke with a cold stillness, the kind that settles before something breaks. Jed stood at the front window, sipping coffee gone cold, scanning the valley like a man waiting for judgment. The signal from the night before still haunted him. He hadn't seen who sent it, but he knew enough to be ready. He'd laid out 3 rifles and reloaded the pistol he kept in the drawer beneath the Bible. He didn't expect to win a war, Just make it cost. Elisa stirred near the hearth. Her face was pale, her eyes too alert for someone her age. You think they'll come today? She asked. Jed didn't answer right away. They'll come, he said at last. It's just a matter of how many and how loud. He barely finished the sentence before a knock thundered at the door. He froze. Not a pounding fist, not fists at all, a heavy, booted kick. The door shook. Jed motioned silently for Elisa to move. She crept toward the trapdoor near the hearth, an old storm cellar, deep enough to wait out thunder or men. Another kick. Then a voice. Open up, Albright. Clyde. Jed moved to the door, rifle low but ready. I told you, you had till sundown, Clyde said through the wood. But then I remembered when it comes to traitors, the law moves faster. Jed cracked the door open just enough to see 6 men, all mounted. 2 had rifles drawn already. None of them smiled. Jed stepped onto the porch, shutting the door behind him. You know what you're doing? Clyde asked. I do. You're harboring a fugitive, James. That ain't just treason. That's suicide. Jed scanned their formation. 2 in front, 4 in the brush behind. Trained. You going to kill a preacher's daughter and call it justice? Clyde's face twitched. She ain't just a preacher's daughter. She's half Apache. She's a message. And she's gonna be delivered. One of the men laughed a short, ugly sound. Another stepped forward. Let's make this simple. Give her up. No more blood. Jed's hand tightened on the rifle. Let me be clear, Clyde said, leaning forward in the saddle. If she's not in my custody in 5 minutes, we come in, house and all. We'll burn her out if we have to. Jed's voice was quiet, even. Then you'd better start with me. Clyde stared. Behind Jed, the door creaked open. He turned in time to see Elisa standing on the threshold. Too thin, too pale, but not afraid. She held up the cross around her neck. Her voice carried, fragile but firm. You think I'm a threat because I carry a name and a prayer. That says more about you than it does about me. Clyde's eyes narrowed. Get back inside, Jed said gently. But she didn't move. I'm not letting another man bleed for me, she whispered. Just then, a sound rose in the distance, hoofbeats, fast and deliberate. Clyde's head snapped toward the horizon. From the north came riders, but not more of his. No dust trail, no shouting, just movement, calm, silent, certain. Jed stepped down from the porch, his voice low. You brought this storm, but I don't think you're ready for it. For the first time, Clyde looked uncertain. Not afraid, not yet, but close. The riders came like ghosts, silent, controlled, unhurried. Out from the northern slope they emerged, one by one at first, then by 2s and 3s, until nearly a dozen horsemen lined the ridge above Jed's homestead. They didn't shout or raise their weapons. They simply watched. Clyde stiffened in his saddle. What the hell is this? Jed didn't answer. From the group, one rider dismounted and began walking slow, deliberate steps down the incline, moccasins barely stirring the dust. He wore traditional Apache leather, weathered and worn, but carried himself with the calm authority of a man who didn't need to prove anything. Chief Ellen. His hair was streaked with gray, tied back with strips of turquoise. His face bore lines of wind and war, and his eyes burned with memory and judgment. Jed recognized him from years past, not as friend, not quite, but as a man who once spared him when others would not. Elon reached the foot of the slope and spoke, calm but cutting. You threaten my blood. You come to the land with fire, but you do not know how to hold fire. You only know how to burn. Clyde drew back slightly. This don't concern you. It concerns all of us, Elan said. That child is my kin. Her mother was my sister. Her father, a man of peace, now rots in a cell built by liars. He turned slightly, facing Jed. And this man, he gave her water when you would have given her death. That makes him family, too. Jed's throat tightened, but he said nothing. Clyde spat into the dust. This is madness. You gonna start a war over one girl? Elan's gaze never wavered. If I must, but I would rather end one. Behind Elan, more riders crested the ridge. Not warriors in paint, but families. Men with old rifles, young boys with slings, even women armed with nothing but eyes that had seen too much loss. Not a war party. A people. This was no ambush. This was a reckoning. Jed stepped forward, voice calm but hard. You're outnumbered, Clyde. And out of time. I suggest you think real hard about what kind of legacy you want to leave behind. Because this right here, this could be the story folks tell for 100 years. And the question is, do they tell it as a warning or a prayer? Clyde's jaw clenched. His men looked shaken. One shifted his reins nervously. Another was already glancing back toward the road. Then Elan spoke again, softer this time. Leave. While you still can. There is no victory for you here. Only memory. Clyde opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked to Jed, and Jed, tired and steady, simply said, You don't have to die a villain, but that's on you now. Clyde wheeled his horse slowly, his eyes darting across the gathered ridge. 7 days, he muttered. Then this land burns. No, Elan said. 7 days to redeem it. And with that, the tide of fate turned, not with a shot, but with silence and eyes that refused to look away. As the dust of Clyde's retreat settled, the ridge grew quiet once more. No one spoke, but every heart in that valley beat with a tension that hadn't left just yet. Chief Elan turned to Jed and gave a slight nod. He'll be back. Desperation always circles before it bites. Jed gestured toward the cabin. Come inside. The girl has something you need to see. Inside, Elisa sat near the hearth, arms wrapped around herself. When she saw Elan enter, something in her posture softened but only slightly. She rose with effort, stepping forward with the map still folded in her hand. I didn't tell them everything, she said quietly. Not even him. She handed the parchment to her great-uncle. Elan unfolded it carefully. His eyes moved across the markings, slowly, as if weighing each word like a burden placed on generations. This is real, he said. Jed stood beside him. You know the places. I know the bones beneath them. He tapped one circle. This one ghost Canyon Me people buried our winter caches there before the army burned our homes. And here, he touched another mark. That's where Jeremiah preached to the tribes in hiding. Jed leaned closer. What was the plan? Elan looked at Elisa. To unify. Not to attack, but to stand so that the government, the ranchers, and the railroads could no longer divide and scatter us. The message was hope, not war. And Clyde wants that map to stop it, to twist it, make it seem like a conspiracy, justify another roundup, another reservation. Elisa spoke now, her voice steadier. We still have time, Jed nodded, but not much. Elan's gaze met his. I will send runners. Quietly, we'll gather what we can. Evidence, witnesses. We'll speak the truth before others can silence it. But you'll need protection, Jed said. And not just arrows and rifles. You'll need someone white, someone the press or the judge can't dismiss so easily. You volunteering? Elan asked. Jed hesitated. Then he reached over to the shelf and picked up a worn Bible. My wife taught me there's more than one way to testify, he said softly, and more than one kind of war worth fighting. He turned to Elisa, who now stood straighter, as though the fire within her was catching flame. You're not just a courier anymore, girl, Jed said. You're a witness. She looked at him. But I'm still afraid. You should be, Elan said gently. That's how you know you're walking towards something that matters. Then Jed pulled from his coat pocket the cross he'd restrung days before. He placed it into her palm. You carry that not because it keeps you safe, he said, but because it reminds you what's worth saving. Outside, the night crept in again, but it no longer brought dread. It brought purpose. For the first time, the weight on Jed's shoulders didn't feel like punishment. It felt like calling. The next morning arrived, cloaked in silver mist, the kind that blanketed everything in hush and pause. For a few stolen hours, the valley seemed suspended in peace, like the world was holding its breath before the hammer fell. Jed chopped wood behind the cabin, rhythm steady, thoughts far from it. Each strike into the log was a prayer without words of plea, for strength, for clarity, for one more day. Inside, Elisa was writing. Elin had given her ink and parchment, and now she bent over the small table with fierce intent, copying parts of her father's letters from memory, his sermons, his words of warning, and above all, his hope. "I want his voice to speak even if mine can't," she said when Jed passed by. He paused. "That's a kind of courage even bullets fear." "Huh?" She smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it. "Do you ever wonder if any of it matters? If doing what's right really changes anything?" Jed sat across from her, wiping his brow with the frayed cloth. "All the time," he said. "But I reckon not doing what's right, sure, don't change anything either." She looked at him, then really looked. "You've lost people." It wasn't a question. He nodded slowly. "Wife, daughter, war took one, fever the other. I've been alone a long time, built fences around more than just this land. And now?" Jed looked out the window where Elon's warriors moved like shadows in the distance, sharpening arrows, checking saddles, quiet as monks before a funeral. "Now I'm tearing some of those fences down." Elon entered without knocking, as he always did, like he'd never left. "They'll come at dawn," he said. "Clyde won't wait past first light. He knows the longer this breathes, the more truth seeps through." Jed stood, shouldering his rifle. "Then we meet them at dawn." "No," Elon replied. "You stay here, with her. I will ride to the canyon tonight, bring the others, the letters, the map. What happens at first light, we face together." Jed's brow furrowed. "You think they'll believe us?" Elon's voice dropped low. "I don't need belief. I need them to hesitate. Truth is not always louder, but it lasts longer." As night settled again, the fire was lit, but the mood remained hushed. No songs, no stories. Just the scrape of boots, the quiet passing of water from hand to hand, and the occasional glance toward the eastern ridge. Jed sat on the porch long after everyone else had gone inside. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tiny wooden cross, his daughter's, carved by his wife the year she died. He hadn't held it in years. Now, he closed his fist around it. "Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Even here, even now." A shadow moved beside him. It was Elisa. She said nothing at first, just sat beside him and leaned her head against his arm. In that silence, they weren't soldier and courier, nor preacher's daughter and old rancher. They were simply two people clinging to what light they had left. And when the dawn came, it would find them ready, not because they were fearless, but because they had chosen not to hide. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The first light of dawn spilled over the eastern ridge like a promiser, a warning. Jed stood at the edge of the porch, rifle in one hand, the other resting on the worn leather of his belt. Behind him, the cabin was quiet. Inside, Elisa and two of Elon's youngest scouts waited, ready to run if the world outside turned to fire. Across the field, Clyde Whitaker and his men lined the ridge, backlit by the sun. They looked smaller in that lightless, like conquerors, more like men clinging to something that no longer belonged to them. Clyde rode forward alone, stopping at the same spot where he had made his threat days before. "Albright," he called out, voice hoarse. "This is your last chance. Bring her out. Walk away alive." Jed stepped off the porch. "I've heard better offers from rattlesnakes." Clyde's hand rested on his holster. "You playing preacher now, too?" "No," Jed said, raising his voice so it carried. I'm just a man tired of watching the strong devour the weak and calling it law. Behind Clyde, his men shifted. Some looked nervous, others just bored, but none seemed eager. Then came another voice. From the far slope, Elin rode forward flanked, now by a handful of elders, wrapped in cloth and time, and two white men Jed didn't recognize, wearing dusty federal coats. One held a satchel, the other carried a sealed letter. The game had changed. Clyde's eyes narrowed. What is this? Elan dismounted. Witnesses, evidence, truth, and the law reel loosened by the circuit judge from Santa Fe. The man with the satchel stepped forward. We've received signed testimony, maps, letters, all confirming your attempts to forcibly suppress religious and political freedom under false claims. Clyde barked a laugh. You gonna throw the whole army at me over one half-breed girl and a washed-up holy man? Jed took a step forward. Be careful, Clyde. You're running out of people who believe that kind of talk makes you a man. Clyde's face twisted, red rising fast. You brought the government into this? Elin replied calmly. Number you did. When you made war on a child carrying a cross. Au long pont Eiffel. Even the horses seemed to stop breathing. Then Clyde shouted, She's a liar. That girl, she's part of a plot. Jed didn't flinch. That girl is a message, but not the kind you fear. She's a reminder that decency still exists, and that people still bleed when men like you pretend they don't. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in Jed, not in Elon, but in the crowd of watchers behind Clyde. One man lowered his rifle. Another turned his head, unwilling to meet anyone's gaze. The spell was breaking. Clyde saw it. Draw, he snarled, voice cracking. Now, M. Yet didn't move. Instead, he dropped his rifle to the ground softly and stepped forward with only his voice. No more blood. Not here. Not today. And for the first time, no one reached for their gun. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Clyde Whitaker sat frozen in the saddle, hand hovering over his holster, jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might break. Jed stood unarmed, now only his voice between him and death. You're not the law, he said, stepping closer. You're a man who's afraid of losing the world he thinks he owns. That girl, her father, these people, they don't threaten you. The truth does. Clyde sneered. You think I care about her truth? No, Jed said softly. I think you care about losing control. He turned slightly, looking toward Clyde's men. How many of you came here thinking you were doing the right thing? He asked, his voice firm but calm. How many of you were told it was a simple Jabrunaways, rebels, Indians causing trouble? He gestured toward the field where Elon and the federal agents stood. You were lied to, and deep down, you know it. A few of the riders shifted in their saddles. One young man looked down at his hands like they'd suddenly become unfamiliar. Jed turned back to Clyde. They came here with evidence, with names, with dates. And if you press this, if you make this valley bleed, they'll carry it to every paper from Denver to Washington. Clyde's fingers twitched, fury and fear wrestling in his face. You gonna stand there and preach at me with that Bible in your coat? Jed didn't blink. I'm not preaching. I'm remembering. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered cross he's daughter's. He held it up for all to see. This was carved by a child, he said, given in hope. It ain't made to fight with, but it don't bend easy either. He walked forward, placed it on a stump halfway between him and Clyde. Elisa carries one just like it, and it scared you more than any rifle ever could. Alan stepped beside Jed now, speaking in a voice low and steady, heavy, with centuries behind it. You tried to turn a girl into a weapon, but she is not yours to use or silence. Then Elisa appeared in the cabin doorway, the rising sun catching her hair, the cross gleaming against her chest. She walked forward with slow, deliberate steps until she stood beside the stump. Her voice was calm. My father taught me to speak truth without hate, but he also taught me not to hide from it. She looked directly at Clyde. You don't get to decide who belongs on this land, or who God listens to. Clyde opened his mouth, but no words came. Because there, in the still morning light, surrounded by warriors, soldiers, settlers, and ghosts, a girl, barely more than a child, had just undone him with nothing but words. Yed stepped back beside her. You brought guns, he said. We brought truth. Let's see which one history remembers. And as Clyde sat there, shoulders slumped, eyes lost, he began to understand. He'd already lost more than he came for. Clyde Whittaker dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dry earth like iron bells. The silence stretched long across the valley. No one moved. Not Jed, not Elisa, not even the wind. He walked forward toward the tiny wooden cross that Jed had laid there. His boots crunched in the dust. His breath was heavy. When he reached it, he stopped. His fingers hovered above the cross. He didn't touch it. Instead, he looked up at Elisa. You think that thing saves you? Elisa didn't flinch. No, she said. It reminds me that saving is still possible. Huh? Clyde's lips curled, but he didn't laugh. He just looked tired, like a man who'd finally seen the wreckage he'd been dragging behind him for years. Then his voice cracked. You know what my father taught me? That peace was a lie. That the only thing that ever changed anything was power. Jed stepped forward. Then maybe it's time to unlearn what he gave you. You think I don't want to? Clyde whispered. You think I haven't tried? He looked around, not at his men, but at the ridge, the land, the sky. I was 12 when they came for our cattle, he said. Apache raiders, or so they said. My brother was shot. My mother screamed until her voice broke. And when the sheriff came, he didn't ask questions. He just burned the whole camp 3 miles north. He looked back to Elan. You remember that, don't you? Elan nodded slowly. I remember the screams of children in the grass, and the ones who were never found. The air turned thick. Clyde knelt beside the stump. For years, I told myself the only way to survive was to strike first. That justice meant striking harder. His hand brushed the cross. But maybe all I've been doing is passing on the wound. He stood, turned back toward his men. You want to fight? He said, voice louder now. There's nothing here but truth. If you came for blood, it'll be yours. His men looked uncertain. Some lowered their rifles. One turned his horse and rode away, not out of fear, but with quiet resolve. Jed walked to Clyde. You don't have to finish this the way your story started. Clyde looked at him. And if I can't change? Jed's voice softened. Then let this be the first thing you don't break. He nodded toward Elisa, and something perhaps for the first time in years shifted behind Clyde's eyes. He stepped back, raised both hands. I won't take her. A murmur rose among the watchers. Elan said nothing, but his warriors lowered their weapons. Jed nodded. Then it ends here. And for the first time in that scarred valley, something unthinkable happened. A man who could have pulled the trigger chose to lay it down instead. Elisa walked to the stump, picked up the cross, and placed it gently in Clyde's palm. He stared at it like it might burn him, but it didn't. It just weighed something different, like forgiveness. The silence that followed Clyde's surrender was not relief. It was a reckoning, a hush, so complete it felt like the earth itself waited to see if it would hold. And then came the voice, firm, lawful, unmistakably official. Mr. Whittaker, called the man in the brown coat, stepping forward from beside the federal agents. You are hereby placed under federal investigation for unlawful detainment, conspiracy to incite violence across territorial lines, and obstruction of justice. Clyde turned, stunned. Who the hell are you? Deputy Marshal Thomas Granger, the man replied, holding up a badge reel, polished, federal, appointed by Judge Amos Carver himself. We received your name weeks ago, but had to wait until the witnesses were safe. He gestured toward Elisa. And now they are. One of Clyde's men, a stocky rider, with a broken nose, spurred his horse to flee. Before he got far, an arrow landed in the dirt at his feet. He stopped. Granger didn't flinch. You're all complicit. But this man, he pointed at Clyde, led the operation, kidnapping a child under false pretenses, forging warrants, and attempting to burn a civilian homestead? You're going to answer for that. Clyde looked at Jed, betrayal swimming behind his eyes. You planned this, he muttered. Jed shook his head. Number, I just chose not to run from it. The other agent stepped forward now. He carried a leather folio and opened it with practiced care. Inside were letter-signed statements, testimonies from tribal leaders, settlers, even a few former allies of Clyde's who had flipped when confronted with jail time. We have more than enough to take this to federal court, he said. Ilan spoke next, calm but fierce. We do not seek vengeance, but we will not hide anymore. Clyde looked around at the faces, Apache warriors, settlers, government men, and one girl who refused to disappear. He looked smaller than before. Not broken, just revealed. Marshal Granger signaled two of his men, who rode forward and disarmed Clyde without resistance. They bound his wrists gently but firmly. Jed stepped back, allowing it all to unfold without interference. You all right? He asked Elisa, who stood beside him. She nodded. Is it over? Jed looked out over the valley. Number, but it's beginning again. This time, maybe the right way. Granger turned to Elan. With your permission, we'll be escorting the girl and the documents to Santa Fe. Her testimony will make the case airtight. Elan looked to Jed, and then to Elisa. If she goes, she does not go alone. Jed nodded. I'll ride with her. Elisa glanced up at him, and in her eyes was something new, not just trust, but belonging. Granger smiled faintly. Then saddle up. We ride by noon. Mo. As the crowd began to break apart, some returning to their camps, others, lingering in quiet relief, would walk to where Clyde had been standing. The tiny cross still sat on the stump. Forgotten? No. Left behind. He picked it up, brushed the dust from its edges, and slipped it into his pocket. Sometimes, the unexpected isn't just rescue. It's the sound of justice, finally learning to speak. Clyde rode in silence, his hands bound, flanked by two federal marshals as they made their way along the dusty trail towards Santa Fe. No one spoke to him. No one had to. He was a man unmasked, but the shame didn't sit heavy on him the way one might expect. Not yet. He still wore defiance in his jaw, like a cracked shield. And deep down, he still believed the world could be bent to the strong hand. That illusion shattered 2 nights later. The caravan stopped outside a town called El Viento Small, windblown, mostly forgotten. But the local mission stood tall, its white steeple catching the moonlight. They tied Clyde to a post near the square. Not to humiliate, but because the townsfolk asked to see him. Not with pitchforks. With questions. One by one, people came. A woman with Apache blood and green eyes asked, "Did you take my brother too?" A Catholic priest held a baptismal record in his hand. "This girl you chased, she was baptized here. You hunted a child of God." Even children came, not to jeer, but to look at what power once looked like, at how it ends. Clyde didn't answer any of them. Not then. But something cracked in him that night, not loudly, but like ice melting under fire. Later, as the group bedded down in the church hall, Jed found Clyde sitting alone, staring at a stained glass window depicting the crucifixion. "You think all this changes anything?" Clyde muttered. "They'll still take the land, still push every last one of them off it." Yet sat beside him. "Maybe," he said, "but maybe this time, folks will know what it costs." Clyde glanced sideways. "You ever kill a man who didn't deserve it?" Jed didn't flinch. "Yes." Clyde's jaw worked. "I used to pray," he said suddenly. "Used to think maybe God was just quiet. Now I think maybe he just don't listen to men like me." Jed looked at the glass again. Or maybe he's waiting to see if we're listening to him. He pulled something from his coat, the wooden cross, held it out. Clyde didn't take it, but he looked at it like a man seeing fire for the first time. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. Jed's voice was low. "Because someone once prayed for me when I didn't deserve it either." The next morning, Clyde asked to speak at the hearing. In front of the judge, the townsfolk, the Apache representatives, and federal officials, he did something no one expected. He confessed to the letters he'd burned, the lies he'd spread, the girl he'd hunted, the preacher he'd tried to silence. He didn't ask for mercy. He asked to be remembered as a warning. And for the first time in a long while, no one interrupted him. Some reckonings come in gunfire, others in silence. Clyde's came with a whisper, "I was wrong." And sometimes that's the first brick laid on the road back. The day of the final hearing dawned quiet and golden, the kind of morning that made the war of days past feel like it belonged to a different life. Jed stood outside the adobe courthouse in Santa Fe, leaning against the railing, watching townsfolk gather. He hadn't shaved. His coat was dusty, but his eyes were clear. Inside, Elisa gave her testimony not with trembling, but with clarity. She spoke of maps and messages, of truth sealed in letters, of prayers whispered over burning fields. She spoke not to accuse. She spoke to remember. The judge, a weathered man with a lined face and a Methodist cross pinned discreetly to his lapel, sat in silence for a long time after. Then, in a voice as even as the desert horizon, he ruled. The charges against Reverend Jeremiah Nanton were dropped. The attempted seizure of tribal lands by proxy was declared unlawful. Elisa would remain under federal protection until her father's release. As for Clyde Whitaker, was sentenced to 20 years in a military prison, with no parole for 10. But even that wasn't the real ending. That came 3 days later, when Jed returned to his ranch. The fences were still standing. The wind still carried dust. The creak of his saddle still sang like an old hymn. And as he stepped onto the porch, he found something waiting. A simple wooden box. Inside was a cross knot, his daughter's, but new, carved by hand, rough, imperfect, tied with rawhide. And beneath it, a note in uneven script. "Thank you for showing me that justice isn't vengeance. My name is Elisa Nanton. But you gave me the rest of it back." Jed held the cross in both hands, eyes closing. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stood there, listening to the wind, the silence, the land, and maybe, just maybe, to God. Because in that moment, something opened inside him, not like a wound, but like a door. The first light had come, not with thunder, not with fire, but with truth. And it had been enough. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Spring came early that year. The snowmelt crept gently through the arroyos, turning the dust into green for the first time in many seasons. And in the quiet of the hills, Jed Albright's ranch remained unchanged to the eye, yet somehow entirely different. The fences still needed mending. The horses still needed feeding. But Jed moved through his days now with a steadier rhythm, as if something inside him had finally stopped running. Elisa wrote often. Her letters arrived in careful script, sometimes carrying fragments of sermons her father now gave freely, sometimes with sketches, church spires rebuilt by mixed hands, a school rising from adobe, a clinic stocked by donations sent from churches and synagogues across 3 territories. She never once called Jed father, but she signed every letter the same way, "To the man who taught me what it means to stay." Elon visited once, riding in with 2 of his sons. They brought smoked meat, laughter, and stories around the fire. Before leaving, Elon pressed a hand to Jed's shoulder. "You didn't just protect blood," he said. "You helped protect memory." Jed only nodded. He never liked long goodbyes. But one morning, while brushing down his mare, he heard it again. The sound, low and soft. A whistle, 3 short, 1 long. The night bird's call. He smiled, without turning around. Took you long enough. From behind the barn, a young rider appeared, grown taller now, stronger. Her braids shorter, but her eyes the same. Elisa dismounted and handed him a bag of seeds. "From the mission garden," she said. "They grow better when someone cares." Jed looked at the bag, then at the soil cracked beneath his boots. "Maybe it's time," he murmured. She nodded, and together they knelt scarred, one still healing, and pressed new life into the land where truth had once stood its ground. Weeks passed, and the seeds took root. So did something else. Word spread quietly at first, then louder than expected. About a girl who once carried a map instead of a rifle. About a preacher who turned prisons into pulpits. And about a rancher who said no to power and yes to conscience. In towns across the Southwest, new sermons were preached not just from pulpits, but from porches, from store counters, even around campfires. The kind of sermons that didn't need scripture to be sacred. Jed read about it once in a folded newspaper left by a passing traveler. Child courier exposes land scheme. Judge rules in favor of tribal rights. He didn't comment, just folded the page and tucked it under his Bible. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the hills in orange and ash, Jed walked the fence line again alone, as he had done for years. Only now, his solitude no longer stung. He paused near the gate and looked toward the ridge where the first riders had come, where truth had once stood fragile and then firm. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wooden cross, the one Elisa had left, the one Clyde had once touched with shaking hands. This cross had seen hands that harmed and hands that healed, and somehow it had survived them both. He turned it slowly in his fingers, then looked up at the sky. "Maybe we ain't meant to fix the whole world," he murmured. "Maybe just the part that crosses our path." The wind answered with nothing, and yet it felt like enough. Back at the cabin, the lantern burned warm. Elisa sat at the table, a new letter half written, her handwriting more confident now. She looked up as he entered. "What did you see out there?" she asked. Jed didn't sit, just stood in the doorway and answered without hesitation. "Legacy," he said. "Yours, his, maybe even mine. Because sometimes the most lasting message doesn't come from pulpits or printed ink. It comes from a choice, repeated, reluctantly, righteously, until the truth, finally, stands tall enough to cast its own shadow." Years passed, and the land, as it always does, remembered quietly. The wind still traced the ridges. The fence posts still leaned just enough to remind you time was real. And the wildflowers, those stubborn, holy things, kept blooming where the ashes had once settled. Jed Albright grew older, but not bitter. His hands stayed busy, his porch stayed open, and every now and then a rider would appear from the horizon, a child grown, a traveler curious, a soul carrying something too heavy for one back. He never turned them away. One spring, a stranger came asking for Elisa. She wasn't there now, teaching in a school nestled between canyon walls, but Jed led the man to a cedar box beneath the porch. Inside were her journals, her father's sermons, the cross. The man opened one page and read a line aloud. "God speaks loudest through those who dare to kneel beside the broken." Jed nodded. She wrote that the night Clyde stood down, said she wanted people to remember that courage doesn't always come with a gun. The man looked up. "This happened?" Jed gave a tired smile. "Every word, just not always the way folks expect from Wild West stories." Then he added softly, "But this one was true." He never said more than that. Didn't need to. The girl had grown into a voice. The voice had grown into a movement. And the land, once divided by silence, now echoed with a softer kind of thunder. A kind that didn't break things. It healed them And when Jed's time came years later, under a soft Sunzithese chair sat empty, but never alone. The porch stayed swept. The Bible stayed open. And on the mantel, beside a photograph of a girl with a braid and a man with dust on his boots, was that same wooden cross, weathered, simple, unbroken. Because some stories never end. They just echo across time and memory, like hoofbeats over canyon stone. If this story touched something true in you, something older than fear and louder than hate, consider joining us as we share more true Wild West stories. Stories not just of shootouts and saloons, but of grace, grit, and the kind of courage that heals generations. Subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment. Share this tale with someone who remembers what the world used to be and what it still could be. Because the West wasn't just wild, it was honest, and sometimes it still is.